This is going to be a fun one because I don't think I've actually ever really talked about this. Maybe once or twice on stream, but for the most part, this is brand new conversation for a lot of people coming out to the channel, which thank you each and every one of you for doing. So you have to understand that in a lot of things, I come from a different era. I come from an era where you bought a game, you had the physical disc or media. I remember Baldur's Gate coming in a pack of about 6 discs. It was wild back in the day. And for those of you that are the OGs, you'll remember floppy disk games. Point being, I come from an entirely different era on a lot of things, which leads us into today's topic of the anime, manga, as some people would say, quote unquote, otaku or weeb subculture. I came from an era where it wasn't necessarily normalized. We had things like Adult Swim, we had things like Toonami, but unlike nowadays where you can just walk into a strip mall, where you can walk into a box store, and you'll see something like a Demon Slayer hoodie, you'll see some Naruto merch, you might even see some Bleach merch if you're in the right places. That really wasn't the case when I was growing up. And don't get me wrong, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I actually like that a lot of people are able to enjoy the anime and manga subcultures as openly as they can now and not fear being bullied in return. I did come from an era where being a nerd, being a geek, being into Pokemon, being into MMOs, being into Yu-Gi-Oh!, being into anime, Naruto, Bleach, Fruits Basket, Inuyasha, right? It really wasn't socially acceptable. There were also a lot of infamous censorships from the era. There's the classic 4Kids meme of Pokemon Indigo League and the jelly donuts when Brock is clearly holding an onigiri, a rice ball, to complete narrative overhauls like Yu-Gi-Oh! And the Shadow Realm. The Shadow Realm was not an inherently Japanese source material specific concept. That was, as far as I'm aware, that was added for a more Western audience, and now we have Shadow Realm as a meme, which is absolutely awesome. And then we get into the downright silly. Sailor Moon was actually incredibly censored for a Western audience. I believe it was Haruka and Michiru, who were a little more than close in the original source material. But when it came over for a Western audience, it was easier to portray them as cousins. So naturally you get to certain interactions where they are more than close. And with the Western context of, oh, well, they're just family or related in some capacity. What in Sweet Home Alabama do we got here? I digress. This is all to point out that I, in fact, did come from a different era. It wasn't as socially acceptable in the past, and now it is socially acceptable. To me, there's a little bit of a warm-up period for that because I'm just not used to that. Sure, I went to local cons. Sure, I ended up watching Adult Swim. I remember before school watching Inuyasha on Adult Swim. And for all intents and purposes, people like me were the odd ones out. We were the outcasts. We were weird by all intents and purposes. And so what I want to point out today is even being from a different era, even being the quote-unquote weird one and ostracized and even bullied in certain capacities, it's really cool to see how Western society has become a lot more accepting of anime as a media. We had certain stores for specific things. I actually still have my Hidden Mist headband from one of those stores, and I've had it for a number of years. Don't get me wrong, you can't necessarily walk down to a large box store. You can't necessarily walk into some random clothing store and expect to find it. But what I can say is a lot of these box stores will have certain merch in regard to anime. You could walk into, say, a Walmart and you could find a Naruto ballpark cap. You could walk into a Target and you could find a Demon Slayer t-shirt. Things like the headbands are a little more niche, and there are obviously certain specialty shops for that. If anything, I can't wait to be able to go back to conventions because I really did like that. And don't get me wrong, conventions nowadays, hearing how Anime Expo went in this past year, there have been a number of conversations in regards to safety, in regards to what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. A lot of these conversations have already been had, and for new people coming to the sphere, unfortunately, things just haven't changed enough in a progressive capacity that now a new influx of people are coming in from, all walks of life, all shapes of all sizes, and now they're having to come in and deal with that. Don't get me wrong, every fandom has its leeches, every fandom has its issues. If you take something like the Pokemon TCG, you could run into people that can say, oh, well, you're not running the full art versions, you're not running the max rarity, get out of here with that. Rarity snobs do exist in games, we just choose to ignore them. I promise you, your secret rare Ultra Ball does not in fact do anything different than a regular printing Ultra Ball. I promise you, from a mechanical standpoint, they are the same. That being said, and I'm guilty of this too, we like pretty things. I like pretty shiny cardboard. I've spent way too much on pretty shiny cardboard in the past. Even Warhammer 40k, I've heard on good authority, you never go to the Warhammer 40k forums. But by extension as well, I hear that is a thing with Final Fantasy XIV. You just find the weirdest posts on there. Every community will have its issues. and the anime manga culture is no different. What's awesome about its new acceptance into the widestream mainstream media is that there's so much potential for change and so much potential for it to be better. I have definitely gone to conventions, and there's people that I personally do not want to see when I hop into a convention. So naturally, because I don't want to see people for one reason or another, I will end up darting, between certain vendors. I'll dart between certain hallways. Generally, I'll end up in the tabletop room and I end up playing the Naruto CCG for approximately 3 hours. Now you can start to see more and more people. Now you can have potentially more meaningful interactions. Obviously within reason. If people are going with a group of friends or if people are going strictly to not communicate or socialize, I mean, that is perfectly acceptable. Having new influxes of people is generally a good thing, and it's up to the legit people in the community, as I'll word it, to showcase that it's not this weird or it's not this unaccepting environment that some of the elitist or snobs or toxic people in the communities would have you believe. On the flip side as well, because we do have an influx of new people, that can also bring its own challenges and can even bring its own toxic people into the mix with those new people. But rather than worry about who could be a problem, who is already an existing problem, what potential problems might lie, what we're still trying to figure out, we should champion that this is an immense step for people feeling comfortable just being themselves, to normalize certain forms of media that, for all intents and purposes, are incredibly valid and sometimes better than other forms of media. Wherever you fall in that aisle, whether you like shoujo, whether you like shonen, mecha, psychological, thriller, action, horror, there's a lot that anime and manga do have to offer, and a lot of stories that I just don't see in a lot of modern Western media. There's absolutely some amazing stories out there that you can watch. There are things like Code Geass, which is my all-time favorite anime. I love going through it every single time I go through it, and I look at things in a different light on every subsequent rewatch. There are things like Inuyasha that transcend genre. Is it a shonen? Is it a shoujo? Is it a romance? Is it action? It kind of transcends all of these things. Or maybe something more action-packed is up your alley like Bleach, where you have such a wonderful cast of characters and each of them has their own different abilities and their own personalities, and they interact in such interesting ways. And then you'll have organizations in it like the Espada, which a lot of people did like. Don't get me wrong, I like my Western media. I absolutely love Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy. I love Star Wars. I love a lot of Western media. I'm not inherently saying one is inherently better over the other because of what media it is. I do think that a lot of people have started to see anime and manga in a light where they are telling good stories. They are coherent, competent stories. And sometimes in certain cases, they're not unwilling to break a status quo. They're willing to make you think. They're willing to engage your critical thinking skills. Take a look at something like Mobile Suit Gundam and subsequent Gundam series, where each Gundam series is based off of some real-world conflict in some capacity. Obviously, there are exceptions like Build Fighters, where that's more of a shonen kind of thing, but we're talking the mainstream, right? Mobile Suit, Zeta, Double Zeta, UC, Double O even, and it does bring a lot of commentary to the table, and it does engage your critical thinking skills. Circling back now, to me, as someone who did grow up being ostracized and even bullied because I did like things like anime and manga, it's very weird just to be able to walk into, say, some big box stores or some big chains and just see anime merch everywhere. But that's not because I think it's bad. In fact, I think this is a very good thing. It's helping to normalize forms of media that up until this point in time had just been largely dismissed. And while I may have fallen out of the mainstream anime community years and years ago just because work and things did crop up, those that are returning to the sphere or even new people coming in are going to feel accepted and welcomed and going to have a lot more support than people like me had when I was in it. But what are your thoughts? Do you think it's weird that we have all this anime merch and all this manga merch? Do you think that this is the necessary extension of what we had prior? Do you, like me, think that this is a net positive, where you're going to have people returning to the sphere or people coming in fresh and being able to feel accepted and validated? Let me know in the comment section. As always, please be civil, all that fun stuff, and I will see you in the next one.